Thank you so much, everybody, for taking your time. I know for some of you, it might be a holiday. So if you're celebrating this weekend celebrations, we wish you well. And thank you so much for taking time off to join us for our webinar series today. So this is the second of our webinar series. And if you missed our first one that happened last week's on Friday, same time, April 8th, we will be sure to share the recording in the chat, and we welcome you to have a look at it. So briefly, we covered the introduction. We introduced, we did some introduction about ISWP and then our training activities. And then we focused on steps 1 and 2. So in today's webinar, we will be focusing on steps 3 and 4. So that is prescription and ordering. So the learning objectives is that we'll start off with the background. I'm sure most of you are familiar with our activities and what ISWP does, but just to be sure that everybody understands our activities, and for those who are new to our organization on our webinar, I think it'll be nice to have that background. So if you can bear with me for the first 10 minutes, I'll be doing the same overview and activities that I presented in the last webinar. And then we'll go over the project methodology and the general results, and then jump straight up to specific results for the WHO steps 3 and 4. So my colleague here, Sarah Monera, will be leading that section, and then we'll touch base on the resources towards the end. So let's get started. So as a background, 70 million people require an appropriate wheelchair to enable them to participate in their communities. The World Health Organization, WHO, estimates that only 15% have access to the products and services they require. Lack of appropriate trained personnel to provide the services is one of the key barriers to meeting the global wheelchair need. So the enactment of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and the publication of the WHO guidelines on the provision of manual wheelchairs and wheelchair personnel training packages raised global awareness of the immense and urgent need. So these are some of our the global organizations and initiatives promoting assistive technology. So this is WHO, SCATE, and ISPO, the International Society of Prosthetics and Orthotics, and ISWP. So ISWP, to build on this momentum, was established in 2015 to serve as a global resource for wheelchair service standards and provision through advocacy, training, testing, standards, evidence-based innovation, and a platform for information exchange. So University of Pittsburgh's extensive experience in wheelchairs and mobility enabled us to receive a grant to launch the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals in 2015. We are funded by the United States Agency for International Development, it's USAID. So we focus on advocacy, training and education, product standards, and all of our activities and research. Sorry, if you're just joining us, please, can you kindly mute so everybody can hear me well? Thank you. So our activities are evidence-based, and we do extensive research on all the activities that we do. So today we are going to focus on the training and education. And I would like to share some of our training and education initiatives. Almost all of them are available for as open access on our website. So we welcome you to have a look at it on our website too. So the basic test and intermediate knowledge test, the trainer recognition process, basic skills test, educator survey interview and publications, and the certification, that's the seal that you'll get after you receive the certification from us. We have the Seating and Mobility Academic Resource Toolkit, the hybrid programs. We have a group-specific specifically focusing on the certification and activities related to that. That's the Professional Standards Board. And our another exciting community, academic training partners. We have over 30 partners there from several countries. And if you're interested to participate there, more information again available on our website, and feel free to also email me. I'll be sure to drop my email in the chat. And our mentoring program. And finally, the project that we are talking about today, the revision of ISWP online modules based on the WHO Wheelchair Service Training Package. So I would like to focus on our integration subcommittee. So they fall under the training working group, and we have 10 members from various universities and nonprofit organizations. The purpose of this committee is to integrate wheelchair provisioning into pre-professional training curricula via evidence-based training materials and methodologies. So the starting point for our online course development has been our organization GATE, from WHO, the release of several packages over the years, starting with the guidelines in 2018, and recently the training of trainers recently in 2017. So the foundation of our online course has been the WHO 8 steps. And so we have taken the WHO wheelchair service training packages as a base and developed our online training series, which is again open access, available freely on our website. So these are all the online courses available on our website. The basic package only is available in 4 languages: English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And managers and stakeholders available in English and Spanish. And then the training of trainers, basic and intermediate, again, English and Spanish. So highlighted here in this section is the training resources timeline. So the basic, intermediate, managers and stakeholders, and the training of trainers were all published over the years from 2012 to 2017. And our online course, we started to develop the online course in 2019. So this is the timeline for your reference. So 2018 is when the WHO released the guidelines for the provision of wheelchairs in less resource setting. And then 2012 to 2017 is when the WHO packages one by one were released. And these packages are to be in person or 40 hours, and they're divided by part A, part B, theoretical and practical. And our online modules were released in 2019. And like I mentioned, our content is based on the WHO wheelchair service training packages, but not entirely on them. So we've also used other resources. And these online courses have been widely used by our partner organization as hybrid training. So where the participants will take the online course first and then go in for the in-person training. So we call this as a hybrid training. So the project rationale for this project is that the flexibility constraints, the graphics, languages, and number of stakeholders, and there's been inadequate mechanism to maintain content currency, and content and balance needs to evolve on the basis of experience and evidence. So these are the rationale that the integration subcommittee felt that it's time to review our online modules. So our online modules are ready for update, and then our original goals was to streamline and reorganize the content and then update the content with the latest available evidence. So the methodology is the core team, that is the integration subcommittee members, reviewed the WHO WSTP basic level reference manual, and then once after the review, we sent specific topics to subject matter experts for further review. So there's 2 steps of review right there. And then again, we clubbed all the feedback. We addressed each and every feedback. And then our team put together this webinar series that you're a part of right now. So this is the timeline again. We reviewed the basic reference manuals, sometime from November 2020 to June 21, and then subject matter experts reviewed them. And then our core team put together, so Sarah, myself, and our integration subcommittee chair, who's not with us today, Amira Toshia. So she also helped put together this webinar series, and we are presenting it to you today and the upcoming weeks. So the results are the terminology. Throughout the presentation, we have denoted our organization, content, and terminology with these colors and the symbols that you'll be seeing here. So specifically on terminology, they've been updated throughout the manual based on both expert opinion and published recommendations. So for example, sitting upright has been revised for as neutral sitting posture. So for organization, throughout the presentation, you'll see they're marked through the color pink, and then this is the logo symbol you'll be seeing. And so we've reorganized information among modules and basically combining theoretical and practical information. And we also reorganized information within modules. So for example, steps 3 and 4, the ISWP online module had steps 3 and 4, and we have taken A6 and added it here. That is the modification that the integration subcommittee has proposed. And then for the content, it will be blue, marked in blue on your right corner, lower corner of your screen, and this is the symbol you will see. So whenever you see that color and the symbol, that's the content that we modified. So that's about it from me. I will be sure to address all your questions in the chat, and please feel free to also let me know if you have any questions towards the end of the presentation. So I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Sarah Monera. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kritika, and thank you all once again for joining us. So as Kritika just mentioned, that was the background of why we have done these modifications. And now we will share the results of this process and what are the recommendations of modifications, particularly for steps 3 and steps 4. So I'll share the results regarding terminology, organization, and content. And in the next slide, we can see that for terminology, we have added different parts for the wheelchairs that I will share shortly. We have restructured the modules for organization as with all the other modules that we will be sharing. And particularly for content, we added more characteristics of what an appropriate wheelchair is and more information on how to select the different parts of the wheelchairs. And I will explain all these in detail. So initially, for terminology, there was an updated needed, and if we go to the next slide, thank you, Kritika, we can see that there is a tremendous variation in the terminology that we use to describe both the postural measures, the wheelchair components, and how the user's body is on the space. So fortunately, there are standard terminology and definitions that can facilitate the communication among wheelchair service provider. And Amira talked to us about this on our last webinar, explaining that she from Canada can communicate with me in Colombia, and I can communicate with Norma in Mexico and with George in Romania if we all talk the same language. And we can also communicate this to our users. So that is why it is important to have a shared terminology and knowledge, of course. So these standard terms, can you please go back to one slide, Kritika? Thank you. These standard terms and definitions have been described since 2016 in the International Standard Organization, particularly with the vocabulary and reference access for wheelchairs. These are not currently reflected in WHO guidelines nor in ISWP online learning modules, and it is part of the modifications that we are proposing. So the first term that we changed, and we referred to this in the last session, was the sitting upright. So instead of saying sitting upright, we are using the term neutral sitting posture, because whenever possible, the wheelchair and an appropriate wheelchair sitting system should allow the user to be on a neutral sitting posture, whatever that means for the user. So if we go to the next slide, when we say upright, it just means not laying down. So it's not really a specific, but if we say neutral posture, it's a little bit more specific. It means that the pelvis needs to be upright and level, that the trunk and hips need to be back with neutral following the neutral curvatures, that the hips and legs should be slightly separated, that the knees and ankles should be at 90, and that the head should be upright and in the midline. And this is, of course, for basic wheelchair users. We know that not everyone is able to accommodate for this posture, but let's remember that this is basic. So in the next slide, we can see a little bit more modifications in the terminology. And these were based particularly on the clinical application guide to a standardized wheelchair sitting measures of the body and the sitting support surfaces, as well as the glossary of wheelchair terms and definitions, which are all based on ISO standards for wheelchair terminology. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kritika. So although some sitting measures are discussed in the prescription or step 3 selection for the WHO, we discussed this in last week's webinar. So today we will focus on the changes made particularly based on this glossary of wheelchair terminology. So in the next slide, we can see the original terminology, for example, rests, foot rest, for example, back rest, arm rest, but the revised name that we are promoting is support. So foot support, back support, arm support. And this is because rest is a passive term that may not fully convey all the importance of positioning. So in the next slide, we can see a little bit more about that rationale. When we talk about support, we talk about an active image and required element for posture and positioning. And next slide, please, Kritika. Thank you. And then the support surface should be labeled by the body segment which is intended to content. And we will see a little bit more detail on that later on today. So although there are many body measures and support surface measures, we will only focus on those which are used on the basic training package. And as we mentioned in our last webinar last week, we recommend you to download all these resources because they are super helpful for all of the activities that you do as wheelchair service providers. So here we have a new term that is body support system, and this refers to all of those parts of the wheelchair which are intended to directly contact the user's body. So this includes the seat, the back support, arm support, and foot support. And these support systems are comprised by 2 parts. The first one is the postural support device, and the second one is its associated hardware. And then this structure that is the postural support device is the structure that is attached to the body to support the system or the wheelchair. So it's like the combination of the part that will be touching the user and the part that will be touching the wheelchair. And this support device is comprised of a surface that intends to contact the user's body, that is the contact face, as well as a non-contact face. So if we click one more time, we can see that the contact face often has some type of padding, so foam, for example, and then that material will be in touch with the body of the user, and then the non-contact surface is interfaced with a more rigid structure in that part that will not contact the user's body. And this rigid structure will allow the device to be interfaced either directly or indirectly, if it's with a hardware, to the wheelchair or to other postural support devices. Then on the next slide, we have an example, which is a little bit easier for us to understand in this way. So we have the hardware, which is the back support hardware, that is particularly, in this case, the canes of the wheelchair that will be supporting the hardware, and then the back support. And then in the back support, we have the contact phase, which will be contacting the user's body with the back of the user. And then we have a non-contact surface that will be in the other side. So all of the different supports that we usually prescribe, recommend, and put on wheelchairs should be divided with this specific terminology. And using this terminology ensures that we also meet not only ISO standards, but also RESNA standards. Next slide, please, Kritika. Thank you. So as you see, instead of footrest, foot support, instead of backrest, back support, and instead of armrest, arm support. And also the recommendation from RESNA that the support surface in a wheelchair should be labeled by the body segment it is intended to contact and where it's typically placed, if it's in the midline or in the lateral. And then we have an example on the next slide. So a pad that is placed on the lateral side of the thigh is going to be called a lateral thigh support, instead of the terminology that we have used as thigh adduction. Because the purpose, if we are going to use that to adduct the thighs or to maintain the thighs aligned or to support abduction, the way we are using that, or the purpose that we are going to use that particular support for, is unique for each person. So it should be called by what part of the body it is touching. So for example, here it's touching my trunk and it's in the lateral side of my trunk. So it's called lateral trunk support. And in this next slide, we have all the different parts of the wheelchair. And this is a picture from WHO that I know all of us are familiar with. And some terminology is the same. For example, backrest, push handle, rear wheel, caster wheel, and seat. But there are some terms that should be modified. So instead of brake, our experts are recommending this to be called wheel lock. Instead of footrest hanger, based on what I just explained in the previous slides, it should be called lower leg support assembly. Instead of push rim, it should be called hand rim. Instead of footrest, foot support, as we just mentioned. Instead of calf strap, it should be called by what part of the body it is touching. So it's the lower leg support. And instead of cushion, it will be seat cushion. Instead of armrest, it should be arm support, although the picture that we are currently looking at doesn't have an armrest at all. Another modification that we did, or we recommend, is regarding the manual wheelchair. So the term manual wheelchair is used throughout, both on the WHO and ISWP modules. And particularly, if we go to the next slide, Kritika, there is one terminology that is orthopedic style wheelchair. But if we look at the glossary wheelchair terms and definitions on the next slide, we can see the appropriate terminology, which should be a standard manual wheelchair with non-adjustable frame. Because if we just say orthopedic style wheelchair, it will mean different things for everybody. But if we explain the standard manual wheelchair with non-adjustable frame, then we all agreed on what that is. We have also added anatomical terminologies to the lay terms that are used throughout. And in the next slide, we can see all of these modifications. So instead of sit bones, we said ischial tuberosities, and then in parentheses, we add the particular or the lay term. Instead of hip bones, great trochanters, instead of shoulder blade, scapula, and instead of tailbone, coccyx. So that was all the modifications regarding terminology. Now for organization, in the next slide, we can see the different modules that were part of the WHO and ISWP packages. So we initially have the core knowledge, and then we have the different 8 steps. So if we go to the next slide, as we mentioned on our previous webinar, it was a little bit challenging to have first general information regarding each step, and then practical activities for those steps, particularly on hybrid or completely online courses. So those are the modifications that we proposed, and on the next slide, we can see that on more detail. So for example, here we have in appropriate wheelchairs at the beginning of all the modules, and then we had steps 3 and 4. So what we did is that we added appropriate wheelchairs to a step 3, and then created those in a more cohesive way. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kritika. So prescription had included a section regarding transfers, and we all understand that transfer method is extremely important to consider when prescribing a wheelchair, but we felt that the user training of transfer was more appropriate to include in the user training section. So we took out transfers from prescriptions, and then on the next slide, we can see that transfer education is now part of step 7, particularly, which is when we are going to teach the user how to appropriately transfer from their wheelchairs. And in the next slide, we see another modifications we did regarding transfer, which are described based on the independence level. This was super interesting, and we will talk about this on our last webinar when we talk about steps 7 and 8. And now for content, we added more characteristics of an appropriate wheelchair and more information on how to set up a wheelchair according to how the user is going to propel it. And we will talk about that right now. So most of the content added was for prescription, particularly for step 3, for funding and ordering, which is step 4, we didn't add that much. So particularly on the portion of appropriate wheelchair, we can see on the next slide the original information that we had, which an appropriate wheelchair is the one that meets the user's needs, meets the user's environment, is the right match for the user, ensures postural support, and can be maintained locally. And then in this revised version, we are of course keeping all of those characteristics of an appropriate wheelchair, but we are also adding on the next slide 2 important characteristics. It should be comfortable and it should be affordable. And then particularly for prescription, next slide please, we added different things in specific portions, and I will talk about that right now. So the chair must be set up to meet the user needs, and the user's needs depend, as we all know, on a lot of different factors. For example, the fit and postural support, the type of transfer that the user needs, that the user uses, the propulsion method, the desired activities that the person is going to do, the environmental needs, the components that are available where the wheelchair user is located, and funding as well. So as we mentioned, the type of transfer used, we added more information regarding that on step 7. But for this particular step 3, if we click on the next slide, we can see that we added information on the feed and postural support, the propulsion method, and the components that are available. So if we go to the next slide, we updated this section based on the evidence available. So in feed and postural support, we have the back support height, and we are suggesting that the specific height should be based on user function. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that we have different types of seaters: hand-free dependent seater, hand-dependent seater, and prop seater. So based on that, we are recommending to put the height of the back support based on that specific need. And in the next slide, we can see the different examples. So for a hand-free seater, it can be in the posterior superior iliac crest. For a hand-dependent seater, below the inferior angle of the scapula or higher, depending once again on the need. And then from a prop seater, probably will be a much higher back support, such as in the top of the shoulder. We also added more information or more content regarding the propulsion method. And the original guidelines briefly mentioned different propulsion methods and some aspects to consider, but we wanted to add more information and more detail. So for different methods, we have different methods for propulsion: upper extremities, lower extremities as a combination. And we also need to have in mind that the different terrains and surfaces will make the user to propel the wheelchair on a different way. So if it's a rough terrain, they will probably be propelling with both hands at the same time. But if they are on a curve, they will have to do one hand and then the other in order to keep running. So we expanded and clarified this section using the guidelines that were published by the Paralyzed Veterans of America in 2005 and other peer review references. And we'll talk about that right now. So for the propulsion method, content additions were made, particularly for arm propulsion, focused on the rear axle setup, while content regarding foot propel were added particularly for the seat height. We realized that both the rear axle position and the seat height are integral for efficient propulsion, but for the purpose of these modifications, we have just divided those into two. So in the next slide, we can see information particularly regarding the rear axle position. So we have one recommendation from the provision of preservation of upper limb function following a spinal cord injury, and the recommendation number 8 says that we should adjust the rear axle as far forward as possible without compromising the stability of the user. So these will appropriately center the center of gravity within the wheelchair and support the user's propulsion in a more appropriate way. So an appropriate pushing propulsion, as just mentioned in this recommendation, is to have the rear wheel axle directly below the acromion when the user is sitting upright. And a new picture needs to be drawn or created in order to explain this a little bit further. In the next slide, we have another recommendation, which is regarding the upper extremity position. So the recommendation is to position the rear axle so that when the hand is placed in the top dead center position of the push rim, the angle between the upper arm and the forearm is between 100 and 120 degrees. And on the next slide, we can see the recommendation, particularly for the seat height. So for those who are foot propellers, the height of the seat from the floor, including the cushion, should be 1 or 2 inches less than the lower leg length with the shoes on. So that will ensure that the user will be able to appropriately propel their wheelchairs with his or her feet. And the removable foot supports are essentials for this type of users since they will be propelling with their feet, and it will also support or facilitate transfers. So we see all the things that we added for feet and postural support and then for propulsion methods, and we are also adding things regarding components available. So in the next slide, we can see that the updates on this section are ongoing, but we are keeping two main principles of pressure relief. The first one is that this pressure relief should distribute the wheelchair user's weight as evenly as possible across the pressure tolerant areas of the user's body and sitting surface. And the well under the ischial tuberosities will allow to redistribute the pressure as well as keeping the pelvis upright. So in summary, we did significant updates regarding terminology throughout these two steps, step 3 and step 4. We combined the theoretical and practical information regarding wheelchair prescription selection as well. And we added evidence-based information regarding wheelchair setup. In this next slide, we can see all the resources and peer review papers that we used to support these modifications. And we want to thank especially all the different subject matter experts that help us with these modifications. And finally, we have one more slide, just remembering you all to be part of the next two webinars that we have, which will be on the next 2 Fridays, same time. Thank you all. If there are some questions or comments, I can see some comments here in the chat from Paminda and Ali. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sarah. So does anybody have any questions for us for steps 3 and 4? Yes, Isaac.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, first I want to say thank you for the nice presentation. I have a question on the back support for hand-free users. So I think if I'm not mistaken, the landmark was on around ISIS. Is it? So most of the wheelchair that currently we are using, they have the higher back support. So how you consider these things? Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac, for your question and comment. So yes, if the person is able to sit with their hands up, so they have really good trunk support, that will mean that the height of the back support should be lower. We put as a reference the posterior iliac crest, but of course it can be a little bit more. And also, you are talking about the different supports that we all have access to, which are different in all of the contexts that we live in. And that is something to take into consideration as well. So probably not everyone will have access to height supports that can be modified in its height, but it is important to take that into consideration as well and to make modifications whenever possible. So if you are able to talk to a dealer or to a person that fabricates these supports, then a request can be to make different designs based on the different needs of the users. Thank you.
May I comment on Isaac's question, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Isaac, with the basic standard non-modifiable frame type wheelchair, frequently if the back height of the upholstery is too tall, there is enough hardware there where you can lower that without having to purchase or manufacture an additional one. This would help the user of the wheelchair greatly from a financial point of view, and you would solve the problem in a much more expeditious way.
Thank you. That is a great comment, and I just remembered that problem solving was one of the main portions that we weren't sure where to add, and we will talk about that in our next webinar. But we need to be problem solving throughout, right? All the time, and making the best we can with what we have available. So thank you so much for that comment.
Thank you all. Does anybody have any other questions for us? Okay. Thank you so much for your time again today. So please feel free to join us for our next 2 webinars happening on April 22nd for steps 5 and 6 and April 29th for step 7 and 8. Thank you so much. I'll also be sure to send reminders. Thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all.
Bye-bye.